everybody. This is the Wednesday, February 1st afternoon session. Carla, could you please call the roll? The first item.
Item 102, accept the City of Portland Comprehensive Annual Financial Report for fiscal year ended June 30, 2016.
Mr. Rust, thank you. And if you could state your name for the record, you know how this works.
Good afternoon, Mayor Wheeler and members of the City Council. For the record, my name is Ken Rust. I'm the city's Chief Financial Officer and Director of the Bureau of Financial Services, Revenue and Financial Services, excuse me. Joining me this afternoon is City Controller Michelle Kirby, and we will be presenting to you today the city's Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, or CAFR, for the fiscal year ending June 30th, 2016. We will be discussing with you highlights from the CAFR, and we'll be presenting you with additional information regarding the city's long-term fiscal health. At this time, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Michelle.
Wait a minute, you can't do that. That's what I did to you. Hi, Michelle.
I'll take over. Good afternoon, Mayor Wheeler and members of the City Council. The preparation of the annual CAFR is quite extensive, and it involves input from many of the city's bureaus, the City Auditor's Office, and our independent auditors, Moss Adams. The accounting division of BRFS has the responsibility of preparing the CAFR, ensuring its accuracy, and working with the auditors throughout the process. Several of the accounting division team members are here today, and if I may, I'd like to take a moment to recognize them for their hard work and dedication to the project. And this is the accounting division group back here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's important for financial information to be timely in order to be relevant to the readers. And I'm very pleased to be able to report to you that the June 30, 2016 CAFR was published on November 15th, which is 135 days after fiscal year end. This marks the earliest CAFR publication in over 10 years. It also puts us on track to meet our goal of CAFR 120, as we intend to publish the 2017 report by November 1st, 2017, or 120 days after fiscal year end. The CAFR provides a look at the city's finances as of our fiscal year end, June 30th. It's prepared in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles, which are issued by the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, known as GASB. The independent auditor's opinion letter is included within the document and informs the reader about the accuracy of the financial information about the report presentation and its compliance with the accounting standards. Unfortunately, this required format and level of detail can make the CAFR very difficult for many to understand. So to address this issue, the accounting division looked into alternative ways to provide financial information to the community. So a popular report is designed to provide a summary level overview of a government's financial picture in an easy to understand format for those who do not need the level of detail found in the CAFR. The accounting division has prepared the city's first PAFR, and it looks like this.
And to the CAFR, which looks like this, you can see the smaller size.
Just size alone gives you an idea. We hope this will be a useful tool that supplements the more detailed information found in the big CAFR. We welcome your feedback and thoughts on the report because we want it to be seen as a useful tool to communicate with the community. Hard copies were provided to your office last week, and the report can be found online with the rest of the city's annual financial reports. So turning our attention back to the CAFR, we'll discuss the highlights of the fiscal year 2015-16 CAFR. The good news is that our external auditors gave the city an unmodified or clean opinion. and found no weaknesses or deficiencies in the city's accounting processes. In addition, the CAFR complies with state law, fund balances continue to grow, and we received the Government Finance Officers Association's Award for Excellence in Financial Reporting for the 35th consecutive year. The not-so-good news is that we continue to see a decline in the city's net position for governmental activities. In fact, the fiscal year 15-16 city net position for governmental activities declined approximately $273 million, which brings it to a negative $1.4 billion.
Could you do me a favor and translate that for people who may be watching this?
We're going
May
to talk
not
a little
know
bit
what
more
you're
about
referring
that
to.
and try to
Okay.
tear that down so that it's more understandable to both the council and others who may be
Great.
listening.
Thank you.
The negative trend is primarily the result of GASB accounting rules for pensions, but there are other factors involved. And I will now turn it over to Ken, back to him, who will provide you with more detailed assessment of the trend and the city's long-term financial health.
Thanks, Michelle. On the next chart, we show the 10-year trend in net position for the city. And you can see we have 3 lines on that particular chart. The blue line represents net position for governmental activities, which is primarily composed of the city's general fund and its transportation programs. Business activities are shown by the orange line and are primarily comprised of the city's big utilities, water and environmental services. And the green line is simply a summation of those two. And you can see on the trend line that there's been a downward trend, particularly on the governmental activities over the last 10 years. It went negative last year at about $1.2 billion as we implemented the GASB 68 standard for pension accounting, and it increased, as Michelle mentioned, even more this year to about a negative $1.4 billion. In contrast, the orange line, or the business activities line, has had steady upward progress, representing the investment that those utilities are making in assets and the general continued strengthening of those utilities in terms of their net position. Overall, the trend is down, but it's heavily influenced by the underlying conditions of governmental activities. So what affects net position? Mayor, you were asking, how do we understand this? And this is something we've been talking with council over the last couple of years. And I put together this chart, factors that affect net position in terms of decreasing it on a GAAP basis. And really what happens there is when expenses are greater than revenues, it has the effect of driving down our net position. So things that can drive down our net position are increases in pensions and other similar kinds of obligations and liabilities, increases in bonds payable with no offsetting assets, and when we have and incur non-cash expenses that contribute to expenses overall exceeding revenues. And I'll talk a little more about what that is. On the other side of the chart, we have things that can actually increase our net position. And when revenues exceed expenses on a GAAP basis, that gives rise to increasing net position. So the kinds of things that can contribute there are, if we get grant funds to build something, that money comes to us and helps us build an asset, but we don't have a corresponding liability, net position goes up. If we fund capital improvements from cash flow, our net position goes up. We're not incurring any debt obligation that offsets that asset. And if we take surplus revenues and just hold on to them or pay down liabilities, that has the effect of increasing our net position. So those are the kinds of dynamics that are in play here that help you understand why would we be in this situation where our net position for governmental activities has declined to $1.4 billion. And what's really driving that primarily is FPD&R. There are other things as well, but the 3 big things that are the contributing factors are FPD&R, urban renewal indebtedness, where we take on the liability, PDC gets the bond proceeds and spends it. We don't tend to get an offsetting asset. And for those bonds where we've helped finance other activities in the region, we gave Metro $100 million for the convention center expansion. $74 million still sits on our books and records. And in exchange, we're in an intergovernmental agreement that we'll receive resources back, but we have a liability, no asset. And one of the big things that we have seen over the years is that depreciation, which is a non-cash expense, our annual depreciation in governmental activities is about $100 million greater than the capital investment that we make each year. And almost all of that is attributable to transportation, where the amount of depreciation for transportation is about $110 million greater than the investment that they're making on an annual basis. So those are some of the underlying factors that are driving our net position in the direction that it's at. What I did on the next chart, and we talked about it the last couple of years, is because of the way in which we are obligated to measure assets, revenues, and liabilities under GAAP and GASB, tends to estimate or it doesn't give us really full credit for some of the unique aspects associated with, particularly with FPDNR. And we've had a lot of discussions about FPNR. FPNR right now has an unfunded liability of $3.4 billion. So we have that liability on our balance sheet. We're reflecting that in our net position. But we also have a dedicated property tax levy that we use to pay that obligation, the expense of that each and every year. The value of that tax levy that we have on, that the voters approved back in 1948, the value of that on a GAAP basis is zero. But we know that that's how we're going to pay for it. We know it's always been sufficient to pay for it. In fact, we test that regularly to see that if it's adequate to be paid for. So if we take that into account, that we really have this large liability, but we have a corresponding way to pay for it, that has a tremendous impact on the way in which we can measure net position. We also know that we've issued bonds for urban renewal, and about 25% of those monies come back to us in the form of an asset from PDC, but all of that debt is paid for from a property tax levy associated with urban renewal indebtedness. So it doesn't really create any liability for us in terms of our ability to pay that. We think it's fair to reflect that in our financials in a restating of the net position as well. And I had mentioned earlier the convention center bonds, where we have an intergovernmental agreement between the city, the county, and Metro, where we receive monies from the county to pay debt service on the bonds, and it's always been fully adequate to do so. So when you make those adjustments to the GASB net position, you see what we've shown in this particular chart, and what happens is governmental activities over this 10-year period, they're pretty much flat, really not much change in that when you take into some of the things that we're not allowed to include on a GAAP-GASB accounting basis. And then when you add to it the orange line, which is the business activities, which is trending upward, you see an overall net position trend that's stable to slightly growing. And we think that that's a better reflection of the city's true underlying net position and financial condition. So what does this mean, and what should we do? And we've had a lot of discussions about this over the last few years, is that we recognize that GAAP accounting has limitations in terms of accurately assessing financial condition, in our opinion. It tends to focus on liabilities and give us less focus or credit to contractual or other dedicated revenues that we receive over time, like the FP&R levy. Without adjusting for non-GAAP items, the net position can lead to focusing on the wrong trend. We certainly are concerned about FPD&R, but because of the way in which it's funded, it really isn't a problem. But if you didn't tear away and tease out some of the things going on here, you would focus all your energy on solving a problem that really doesn't exist and miss the problem that we really have to struggle with, and that is the perennial and consistent underinvestment in infrastructure. That's the more fundamental issue when you tear away the pieces of net position that we should be concerned about, that I think we need to focus on, and we've been talking with council about that over the last couple of years, and have made some considerable effort to increase the investment that we're making in our infrastructure. We've also been looking at how the most important thing we can do is make decisions that avoid short-term and long-term financial impairment, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And one of the tasks I've been assigned to is to try to give the council an idea of what are those longer-term financial issues that we should be concerned about. And last year, presented to you the famous little fiscal health snapshot that I know was a way to distill down a lot of complex information in categories that I think you and others have found very useful. And when I started looking at the things that you should be concerned about and be paying attention to, I looked at three general categories of fiscal activity that we should be always watching. One are our long-term liabilities, PERS, FPD&R, and other post-employment benefits. PERS, as I mentioned last year, concerns me because it is heavily reliant on high levels of investment returns each and every year. We have an unfunded liability with PERS. We expect that unfunded liability will likely be growing due to things like overturning of the Morrow decision, which had the effect of reversing some of the decisions that would have helped save governments like Portland on their pensions. But in 2015, earnings were low for the pension fund. It earned about 2.1%. It needs at least 7.5% or more to stay even. This year was better. Probably the only thing that good that came out of the election was the stock market went nuts in the last quarter of the year. And we now ended up with something a little over 7% earnings for the year for PERS. Still didn't hit the requirement of 7.5% plus the ability for them to pay COLA. So even though that was not a bad year, we know we're going to fall behind. So PERS makes me nervous about its continuing impact on the city. FBDNR, in the contrast, I have said that currently I think it's in green status. I think it stays in green status, even though we had some increases in salary costs in a wage settlement that increased police cost, also rolls through to FPDNR pension costs. The most recent levy adequacy study, which was completed about a week ago, simulates potential ranges of cost in real market value property tax growth over a 40-year time period. The probability that the levy will be inadequate over that 40 years has declined to only a 2.6% probability. The last time they did it, it was a 4% probability. So FPDNR, if the tax system being stable the way it is, and as long as we have reasonable real market value growth, I don't believe that's something that we need to worry about. We always have to watch it. Our OPEB liabilities year over year actually declined. And that's another thing that we continue to watch and monitor because we're on a pay-as-you-go funding system for that. And that's the way we've advised council to proceed with it since we were required to begin reporting that back in, I think, 2008. When we look at infrastructure, we know that there's a lot of different areas that we have to pay attention to. The utilities, I feel pretty comfortable with, have a stable and secure funding plan. They have a lot of needs in front of them, but I'm confident that they're going to be able to continue making the investment necessary. I think it's cautionary that we should be always watching that, but I'm not as concerned about that particular area of the city's infrastructure assets than I am with certain other areas. Transportation is the one that we clearly have the most concern about. It's currently in red status. It stays in red status. We've made some improvements over the last year. We have a gas tax. We have a heavy vehicle surcharge and things like that. That's helpful. But we know that the underinvestment's at least $100 million a year, and those monies are primarily oriented at maintenance. So we know that that's going to be a continuing problem, one that we have to focus on.
Can I ask you a question on that, Ken?
Certainly.
So I get the shortfall as far as sufficiency and resources to maintain the capital assets that we have in place. But this is a fiscal report. And the reality is fiscally, we're not going to spend more resource than we have. So it is, when you're talking about the CAFR and the issues that you take up in the CAFR, are you looking at the declining value of the asset? Is that why this is on the report?
That's the linkage, Mayor, is that the net position is an indicator that by itself suggests that the city may be in a position where over time it will be less able to continue and maintain the services that it's currently providing. So when we look at what's causing the decline in net position, we tear apart these little elements of it. And one of the areas that we have to pay attention to is the underinvestment in infrastructure. Because going forward, if we don't address that, the ability of that infrastructure to provide the services that we expect will decline as well. And so that can lead to further impairment of our ability to provide those services.
But is it actually the deterioration of the asset that rises it to the level that it's on the CAFR? I mean, I can think of other services, mental health services in the community, for example, that are not funded to the degree that they need to be, yet that's not on the CAFR. So is transportation there because of the value of the asset deteriorating, or why does it rise to the level of, what gets in the CAFR and what doesn't?
And that's a good question. What's in the CAFR are things that are financial assets and liabilities that were required to record under GAAP-GASB.
Okay.
There are a lot of other things, clearly, that don't have those kinds of values that we bring onto our financial statement that are important and arguably are even more important. But we're looking at those kinds of things that we're required to capture under GAAP accounting. And what we see there is a consistent underinvestment. And there's a lot of interesting things about transportation. We've had the discussion last year, is that we could spend $100 million on transportation, repaving roads, making them very smooth. But it may not be necessarily a capital investment. If it isn't capitalizable, it won't help us close that gap between depreciation and capital investment, because we have a lot of maintenance things. So I'm not saying that by itself is something that we have to focus on and solve completely, but it's an indicator, and I think the indicator is important about when we have an underinvestment, where does that take us? If the accounting information is useful and instructive, but it doesn't tell you all of what you need to do. But if you follow it to its logical conclusion, you do end up with a significantly poorer infrastructure that can't provide services. People can't rely on it to get to and from work. Businesses can't rely on it to get goods and services in and out of the city. And it starts to impair other kinds of things like the ability to grow wealth in the community and generate resources for other kinds of programs like mental health.
So, and I'm sorry to my colleagues for asking elementary questions. Could you go back to the report? Take me off that. Can you go back to the dashboard?
Yes.
Which,
So the, okay, okay, good. All right, good. Thank you. That's helpful to me. I got it.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I have just a question off the, actually, you know what my question is, Ken, so what's your answer?
The answer is the utilities are still in yellow status, and we have done some work on the kinds of things and attributes and factors to take into consideration that would move them from yellow to green status, and things like being in regulatory compliance, maintenance of their infrastructure at a certain level, rates and charges trending towards inflation, things like that. And generally speaking, BES is getting very close to turning to green status. Water is probably a shade of yellow moving to, I don't have an orange I can't put in here, so I can't figure out what the right color is.
We've been actively lobbying for just a split circle.
Yeah, and I haven't figured out how to do that yet. Anyway.
But just to be clear, because I think it's important when you're in yellow status and you're encouraging us to move towards green, it's important that we identify what are the factors that you're considering. And so maintaining our high credit rating, so we can borrow money at low interest rates. Remaining in compliance with all of our regulatory requirements, which of course, at least recently, has gotten more complicated because we're not sure where the regulatory environment's going in Washington, D.C., and it could go one of a number of ways. Continuing to invest in replacing aging infrastructure and in resilience, which our rating agencies give us credit for, and that often means rate increases above ordinary inflation. So do we have the political will to continue to do that? And as I understand it, the reason that we're not quite at green is that a number of these factors are variable. And despite our best efforts, there are some things that are out of our control. So you've given us a yellow and an admonition to continue. Is that fair?
That's correct. I'd like to have stretch goals for you,
Okay.
Very good.
The last category, we've talked about infrastructure liabilities, the utilities. We have others in the form of parks and housing, which has become a bigger issue than we've had in the past. We've made a lot of progress. We're doing a lot of great work, but we know that the need is great as well. So I'm concerned long-term about our ability to continue to fund at the level necessary, but we have done a lot of good things, and we're going to have to continue to pay attention there. We have legacy liabilities associated with the Willamette River Superfund site and Columbia River levees, and we're working through that as well. So those are things that we need to pay attention to. And of course, employee costs is the last category. Things that drive our costs up on employee side, wages, salaries, health benefits, pension benefits, and where we put people all contribute to a potential for us to see expenses associated with employees growing faster than our revenues, and that creates problems for us to manage over the longer haul. So when I met with you last year, those are the things that I identified as being issues for us to pay attention to, not just short term, but on the longer term as well.
So at this point, we don't own any housing. So what kind of housing goes into the grid here that you assess us on as being red or whatever it is, orange, yellow?
We do own one housing project, that's Headwaters. That's one that was done a number of years ago. And with the new authorization that we received from the voters and also some of the dedication of short-term rental, if we're going to finance and help build housing, for a lot of complex reasons, we will probably be owners of housing because that type of financing can only be used if we're an owner. The housing, but we're not just doing that. We also have a lot of tax increment resources being devoted to housing that we support the development of affordable housing through more traditional means. So the housing thing isn't so much what we own, but we know that we have a big need, and we know the city is going to be asked to support adding resources to meet that need, whether we're the owner or we're contributing that in the form of grant funds to developers that are building affordable housing on our behalf. So that's why I've added that into that particular category, because that's an expanding piece of infrastructure for the city.
Does the Housing Bureau own the headwaters?
Well,
I
the
thought-
city of Portland owns that. It's managed, I mean, it was a project developed by PDC. It was financed by city general fund backed revenue bonds, and it's owned by the city of Portland.
So does this chart show any Portland Development Commission assets as well?
No.
And so is that housing, that's relatively new, or has that been on before, now that we're thinking we have passed the bond and we're going to become an owner of public housing?
I believe I had it on there last year as well, Commissioner. I could check that, but it's becoming, it was an issue last year, but I think the issue is becoming bigger,
Right.
is my concern.
So paradoxically, the choice that we've made to provide more housing for people who need it then puts our city financial condition into a worse place. Is that correct?
I would say that if, a worse place in the sense that and I had a really interesting conference I went to last week, was the National Federation of Municipal Analysts. So it's a room full of people that just rate bond stuff for municipal governments. And it was a session on distressed credits, which we're not one. But I was on a panel called Managing the Divides, a lot of the divisions in communities and across the country, rural, urban, suburban, and they were intrigued what Portland was trying to do. I was talking about, in Portland, we recognize this is a big issue, and we're concerned about the impact of inequality and equity in our community and the work we're doing around racial equity planning and trying to make a more deliberate decision about the allocation of resources to deal with some of those divides, and housing being a very big piece of that. And so when you start thinking about that, my scorecard is really financial oriented, but kind of to what the mayor was saying, there might be a whole bunch of other things that we need to be measuring as well. How are we doing in terms of closing the affordability and housing gap, the income inequity gap, the access to fully formed neighborhoods and parks and things like that? Those are important metrics that might actually determine the longer-term sustainability and fiscal health of a community, much like these other more traditional financial measures. Because if I was a bond buyer and I had a choice between two bonds and they each rated the same, but one community is doing a lot better job at bridging these divides to make the community more resilient, sustainable, and supportive, and a place that people want to come, invest, grow wealth, and generate income and tax revenues for the government longer term, where would I put my money? And so that housing piece is an interesting way to start thinking about, even though we could make that number whatever we want to make, but the more we do there, it might make our community a better place to live long-term, and that has important financial impacts and implications for the city of Portland.
Thank you, that's very helpful.
And I'm sorry I missed part of that when I stepped outside for a second. You've referred to the City Lights model, which we use for a prior council used for the headwaters. We considered City Lights for Gray's Landing during the recession because we ran out of financing tools, but we decided to go a different route. But most of the housing that we invest in, we don't own. We just have a regulatory agreement.
That's correct.
So I apologize I missed your colloquy with Commissioner Fritz, but so we're putting a lot of money into housing, but we don't own it. And how is that reflected on our balance sheet?
Those assets aren't reflected on our balance sheet, and we don't generally have liabilities associated with that. We grant funds and do things with PDC resources. Now, some of those PDC resources actually are liabilities on our balance sheet, but because we have a tax revenue associated with it, it doesn't really impair us. Now, one of the distinctions, though, that's different with housing, and I know Commissioner Saltzman's learned quite a bit about this over the last few months, we've all learned a lot about it, is that the voter-approved GO bonds and also the dedication of short-term rental taxes to maybe support leveraging of financing, if it's backed by the general fund, has the city's general fund credit or unlimited taxing power behind it, creates a lending a credit issue under the state constitution and under city charter, and makes it very difficult, I won't say impossible, but so far it's been pretty much impossible to figure out a way in which we can give monies to developers to develop through some sort of an agreement, projects for us without tripping into this lending and credit issues. So hence, we may be actually more directly involved in direct ownership, like the Ellington apartments.
We
for
may
example.
just end up owning it and then partnering with Home Ford or someone to
Manage
help
it.
do the management.
That's correct.
And that then shows up on our balance sheet.
Yes,
'cause
and we'll
it's-
have, there we have, think of it, we have a liability, we issue bonds, but we have an asset, we have the housing.
But that's actually good for our.
It's neutral at least, it's not negative. Oftentimes we get into these asymmetrical financial decisions where we create the liability, we don't get the asset. We did good things with it, but our net position is hurt by it. So for example, when we give the county $80+ million for our contribution to the Selwood Bridge, we're going to finance that with gas tax revenue bonds. That liability is on our balance sheet. The asset is on the county's balance sheet. And so our net position looks worse. Now, is that a bad decision? Well, it's a very important asset. It's an important arterial bridge, and it will be resilient in an earthquake. But it was a good decision for the community, but from a narrow financial standpoint, not necessarily one that makes our balance sheet look better. So those are the kinds of things that we have to be mindful of. I'm going to just quickly finish off here. We've talked with you last year about long-term. Fundamentally, the city has a math problem, and that's that its expenses are growing faster than revenues, and we have to be mindful of that there are things that are going on systemically that we have to pay attention to. And what we're going to have to do to bring that into balance, we have to cut expenses, reduce programs or services, increase revenues, or some combination of the above. And you can see that right this year. We're in a budget process right now, and we're cutting budgets. But general fund revenues are growing. They're going to be higher than they've ever been. And so we already see the tension in that mismatch between the rate of expenditure growth and the rate of revenue growth. And imagine a slowdown in the economy or a recession where we see a decline in those revenues. Those are the kinds of things that we have to be mindful of, because if we don't start thinking about how we are going to try to manage those long-term costs, we will be perennially cutting budgets. And that's something important to think about as you make those budgetary decisions now into the future. I just want to summarize where we've been. It's been a long discussion, and I appreciate that opportunity, but we are happy to present to you the CAFR for fiscal year ending 2016. As Michelle mentioned, it complies with all required accounting standards. We have an unmodified or cleanup in it from our outside auditor, and you'll hear more from them this afternoon. Our budget practices have ensured that the city adopts a balanced budget each year, and we have no audit deficiencies to report. So we're very proud of that. Our current financial position continues to strengthen. Overall fund balances for the city is over $600 million. The general fund has slightly over $100 million. We think that making these non-GAAP adjustments that we talked about, how we look at FPD&R and some of these other things that make our net position look odd, are better ways to really get a sense of the city's real financial position and also understand the kinds of things that we should be paying attention to. We think that that's also more reflective of the fact that the city is a AAA rated credit and has been that way for 40 years. Remember, the CAFR is simply a snapshot at a point of time. Future challenges can affect the fiscal health of the city, but we've weathered many financial storms. And by developing good practices and policies now and making decisions based on that, we can make sure that we can sustain a strong financial performance for the city and the ability to maintain the services that our citizens depend on into the future. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Very good. Any questions from the council? Carla, is there any public testimony on this item?
No one signed up.
Is there anybody you'd like to testify? 3 minutes. Keep it on point, please. Name for the record.
I'm Shedrick Wilkins, and I believe that in the future, the city will have to cut social services. I believe that the city does things by building things like bridges, roads, infrastructure. But I believe this, that only the federal government and the state government can decide the merits of social programs, and not the city. And I think in the future, there'll be the schools, for example, will start begging the city for money, and the city will just have to turn away. Again, social services is very hard to say, whether you need to hire people to manage that. And there are certain mayors that got over this. I remember Bud Clark, for example, was drafted. He was a Republican by the Democrats because the city of Portland was going in debt. And Mayor Clark actually won re-election and managed to cut the budget and got on the Johnny Carson show. So,
Mayor, I move to accept the report.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Carla, please call the roll.
Fritz,
Well, thank you once again for a very clear presentation. And always the work of Chief Financial Officer Ken Rust is fabulous. City Controller Michelle Kirby. I think City Controller is maybe one of my favorite titles for anybody coming to work in the city, that is controlling a lot of money and also making sure that there are controls on that money. This popular financial report is definitely an improvement, well, not an improvement, it's a new thing that's making things much clearer for the population and the neighbours here in Portland. So thank you very much for all your good work. Aye.
Fish,
I want to echo everything Commissioner Fritz has said, and I very much appreciate the way you're laying out the information and the very clear presentation today. Thank you for your good work. Aye.
Saltzman,
Yes, thank you for your good work, and I definitely vote for the popular report. It's great.
Udaly.
Thank you for your work. I'm feeling a little left out because I don't have a copy of the popular report, but I will support it nevertheless.
Wheeler,
Enthusiastically supportive. Thank you. This is great. And as you can note, sometimes in government, we tend to write reports for ourselves. And in doing so, we're unintentionally excluding the public who may or may not have CPAs and knowledge of finance and whatnot. And ultimately, it's their city. They face the consequences, for better or worse, of how we manage our fiscal situation. So I think this is a really great report, and I appreciate it. Enthusiastic aye. The report is accepted. Carla, could you please read the next item?
Item 103, results of financial audit of the city comprehensive annual financial report for fiscal year 2015-16 and related communications.
And we have Auditor Hol Caballero here today to help introduce this item.
Good afternoon, Mayor and
Good
Commissioners.
afternoon.
For the record, I am City Auditor Mary Hall Caballero. It is my pleasure today to introduce Jim Lanzarota, a partner in the accounting firm Moss Adams, which conducted the audit of the city's fiscal year 2016 financial statements. I also have Director of Audit Services from my office, Drummond Kahn. The city's financial statements are important resources for community members, taxpayers, investors, and decision makers to understand what fiscal shape the city is in at a moment in time. Once management has prepared the financial statements, federal and Oregon law and city charter require an independent audit be conducted to determine if the public can reasonably be assured that they fairly represent the financial position of the city. It is important to note what financial audits don't do. They do not provide opinions on whether the city is spending appropriately, making good decisions, or what the long-term future may hold. We have to rely on other types of assessments to determine the answers to those questions. The city entered into a contract with Moss Adams, a licensed municipal audit firm, to conduct this audit, and my office oversees that contract. This arrangement ensures that the outside auditors have an extra measure of independence from the managers whose work is being audited. I'd like to acknowledge Director of Audit Services Drummond Kahn and Principal Management Auditor Fiona Earle for administering the contract and acting as liaisons between the city bureaus and Moss Adams. And I will turn it over to Mr. Lanzarota to walk you through the results.
Thank you.
Mayor Wheeler, it's nice to see you again. You might remember our years over at Multnomah County. We still
Yes.
performed that audit and
Wonderful.
just delivered within the last week their audit report.
Fantastic. I'm glad to hear it.
Fellow commissioners, it's great to come before you. We finished the audit, obviously, back in November and delivered our reports to management, but the audit doesn't feel done until we get a chance to sit down and go over those results with you. Ken and Michelle already let the cat out of the bag, so you already kind of know the juicy stuff, and maybe that's okay. You know, you kind of want those good results, and so I'm here to echo that. So what I'd like to do today is just remind you about what it is you engaged us to do. So we'll talk about the audit process to maybe solidify a little bit your understanding of what that is. Obviously, you want to know the results. I think you know most of the results already, but we'll review that again. And there are some required communications from an auditor. So to meet our professional standards in performing an audit, there are communications that we're required to go over with you. And we issued that to you in a letter form that you should have received already. And I'm just going to hit on a couple things that are in that report. And then, of course, I want to answer any questions that you might have about the process. All right, what did you engage us to do? So I think you have a pretty good understanding of the audit. A lot of familiar faces here. You've seen me here before giving this report, but one new face at least. And so I like to break the audit down for you into about 5 phases. There's like 5 phases to what we're doing. The first one is that financial statement audit. So is this document accurate? Does it accurately reflect the balances at year end and the results of all those financial transactions that you entered into for the year? And within that, there are several entities here. So not only do you have the city, but included in here is the Portland Development Commission, that their financials get rolled into yours. We do the audit of PDC. FPDNR was mentioned by Ken several times. There's a separate financial statement for the activity that runs through that pension trust fund. We audit that activity. And then there's also Hydro. You have a fund here of the city that records certain power operations, and we do a separate audit and issue a report on that. All right, so there's a financial statement piece. Also, I think you have a pretty good understanding of the audit. I mean, that's the independent verification of the information that's here. It's looking at invoices and source documents and talking directly to your bank and who holds the funds, cash and investments here at the city. But a second phase is looking at internal controls. Ken already mentioned that. Michelle mentioned that, we didn't find any findings there. I'll talk about that. But in putting this together, we have an obligation to look at those checks and balances that management uses to be sure that you're collecting accurate information here. If there are weaknesses in those controls and processes through your external audit, we have an obligation to inform you of those weaknesses. A third phase is that since you're an Oregon municipal corporation, the state says, auditors of Oregon Muni Corps, you need to test certain state legal compliance. And there's 7 or 8 areas that we look at. Probably the one that takes the most time is your compliance with local budget law. So that whole process you go through of putting your budget together, informing the public, holding public hearings, and then how you administer that budget during the year. There's a lot of state laws that cover that process. So we do the testing to determine if you met all of those appropriate state laws. That's just one area. There's public purchasing. There's where you put the cash and investments at the city. Do those meet requirements? Insurance, programs funded from outside sources. Like I said, there's about 7 or 8 areas. And we issue a report. If we we issue a report anyway, but that would identify any non-compliance. A fourth phase of your audit is testing federal grant programs. So the city is very proactive in writing grants and bringing resources into the community that weren't generated here. Anytime you are involved in federal grants, there are compliance requirements associated with that. And so the federal government said, hey, auditors of governmental entities, if your client is receiving federal grants, we want you to do some additional compliance testing and then reporting if we identify non-compliance with any specific requirements to those grant programs. And so we did that work and issued some reports there. And then finally, a fifth phase, and I've mentioned this before, you have a phenomenal staff here that I'm glad that you had a chance to recognize their efforts. You put this document together. So in Oregon, there's about 1,700 governments, I believe, that issue financial statements to the state, and it's the minority of them that have the ability to have that qualified staff on board with the technical knowledge to put this document together. And you're very fortunate to have some very highly educated and qualified people that know how to do that.
What do the other jurisdictions do that don't have staff to do?
Yeah, good question. So what a lot of them do is ask their auditor to actually prepare that document. And our firm, although we do some like that, our preference is not to do it because it kind of puts us in that awkward position where we end up auditing our own work. So an auditor has to have enough comfort that even though their client isn't preparing the document, they have enough knowledge to take responsibility for it. And if we're not preparing it, we don't have to go through the hoops to make that assessment. So some of our clients where they don't audit, they'll engage a third party to come in. So sometimes there's a couple CPA firms in the mix. Someone prepares, someone else audits, and that's another way to address that. So that's another item there. So that fifth phase for us is really just the technical review. We don't have to prepare it, but obviously we want to make sure that it meets all the requirements. All right, there's the audit. So the results, well, you already kind of know most of the results. Clean opinion is what we call it in layman's terms. Unmodified is the technical term. So basically, as a result of the work we performed, we came to a conclusion that this accurately reflects those balances and transactions, and it contains the required disclosures under governmental accounting standards. So a very good job there. Also, it was mentioned already on the internal control front, we did not identify any significant deficiencies in the internal controls. We had some, best practice observations along the way with management, but clearly nothing that rose to the level that we would be required to report to you in a written form. On state legal compliance, again, no findings there. Our report is on page 332 of the CAFR, and there is one comment in there that you'll note that identifies a couple funds that ended with negative fund balances. That's not a non-compliance issue, but the state says, hey, if there's some funds back there that have negative fund balances, please point that out. And actually, you point that out in the footnotes already, so management highlighted that, and we did as well in that report. On the federal grant front, we ended up testing 5 of your grant programs, 5 of the larger grant programs. The city received a total of $36 million of federal grants last year. And there's a schedule in here that shows all of the grants that we tested. They actually totaled $84 million. The difference are some loan programs that you have outstanding. So you have a lot of housing-related loan programs and so forth. There was $58 million there. So the total of what you received in cash plus the loans outstanding come to 84. That was the pot that we chose programs to test. A couple things to note about that. We have to make an assessment of whether the city is a low-risk or a high-risk auditee. And you want to be low-risk. If you're high-risk, that means that we've identified problems in the past or management has experienced some issues in the past. Maybe they haven't filed reports timely with the federal government, for example. And we were able to determine that you're a low-risk auditee. You've had a number of years of good findings from your federal grants, and so that's clearly where you want to be. And in all of our testing of the 5 grant programs, there were no findings. So no non-compliance was identified, and we found the appropriate internal controls that were utilized to help you meet the compliance requirements for those grants. So excellent result on your federal audit. Okay, some required communications, and then clearly want to open it up for any questions that you might have. So we issued a letter to you which has the different topics that we're required to cover. And again, I don't want to go over all of those, but I thought there were a couple just that most boards want to hear about. One is, geez, did we meet the timelines? Michelle, here, City Controller, mentioned how you moved up the timeline for issuance of your financial statements. You're our star client this year because most of our clients incurred challenges which actually delayed their process. The city was one of the few that actually got it done quicker. So you took 2 weeks off of the process. I can remember not that long ago, just barely getting the report issued before the year end. And you moved it up to the middle of December and then to December 1st, now November 15, and you have plans to move it up to November 1st. And that's excellent. For our large governmental clients, they really struggle to meet that kind of a time frame. So hats off to your crew for the work that they did, which enabled them to meet that time frame. And I'm really proud of Michelle. I know she's going to present at a governmental conference coming up and hopefully share with other finance officers the great things that you did, which enabled you to hit that time frame. Another thing that our boards like to hear is, did we find any audit adjustments? Were there any errors that required an adjustment to these numbers? And I'm pleased to report to you that we did not identify any errors that existed where we went back to management to tell them, hey, you need to post a correction here. Not only that, but we have an obligation to tell you if there are past adjustments. So these are the errors that are not material, but are they something you'd want to know about? And there were two. So we did identify two errors in these financials. One of them I would attribute to just how excited your staff is about getting the numbers. Oregon PERS, you mentioned a little bit about this new pension accounting, and Oregon PERS publishes information that's necessary for you to post your portion of that plan, and they posted numbers initially that were incorrect. And so they were only on the state's website for about a week before that error was identified. And your crew went out and grabbed that report as soon as it was posted, and ended up using those numbers instead of the revised report that came out later. So there was an error that existed in your pension expense. There's also an identification of a landfill. The city took over responsibility for a landfill, and there are some post-closure care costs that you will incur. And the accounting standards require that you book that liability as you're accepting waste into that landfill, and that obligation had not been recognized in your financial statements in prior years. So the net effect of those two entries was only about $2.7 million, which was clearly immaterial to your financial statements. Another thing that boards like to hear about is, did we have any difficulties? You know, when we're asking questions, were we getting funny responses? Were they withholding information? Did we feel awkward about any of that? And we didn't experience anything like that. I'd say we have a very professional relationship with finance staff. I think we have spirited discussions about how to do things correctly, and those are all positive discussions, so no difficulties. And then finally, any disagreements? I mean, are they pushing an accounting treatment that is not supported by the accounting standards, or were they pushing us in any direction in terms of audit procedures? And we did not have any disagreements with your staff. Again, some spirited discussions about how to apply the accounting standards, all very positive experiences. I feel like I'm talking 900 miles an hour, but let me rest there and just ask if you have any particular questions, or can I shed some light on the audit process?
Jim, I have a couple of questions.
Yes.
And first, for the benefit of our two newest members, how many years have you presented this audit to council?
Good question. You know, we used to not present to you, believe it or not. When we first had the contract, there were several years. I think when your predecessor, Levon Griffith Vlad, I want to say Vlad. She, I think, instituted the process where we come before you and deliver the results. So there were a couple of years under her leadership where we came and delivered this report to you, and then the time that Mary's been here, we've delivered this report to you.
About how many years have you been performing this function for the city?
Since probably 2006, I think, 2005, 2006.
So over 10 years.
Yes.
And so that's I think important context, because my recollection is in past presentations, you have flagged issues relating to grant programs and some internal controls. So,
Yes.
what in light of the fact that you have issued an unmodified clean opinion, what is your conclusion, therefore?
Yeah, well, good questions. I believe in the letter that we issued to you, there is a section at the very end that may comment on past comments from audits. In any time that we've identified internal control weaknesses, we've come to management with some suggestions for improvements. and they've made improvements. So all of those issues that have been identified in prior years have been resolved as a result of changes made to internal controls or processes to where those are now resolved and are not issues any longer. And it's probably been a couple of years. I think you've had some clean results from, so you've probably gone a couple of years without findings from us in terms of internal control weaknesses. Same with the grants programs.
Jim, my second question is, what we have been advised is that by applying governmental accounting standards, we have the opportunity to compare our financial condition against peer cities. And the theory is you create a uniform set of standards and see where we stack up. But the takeaway I get every year from Ken's presentation is that few cities have a pay-as-you-go pension system like ours that we call FPD&R.
Right.
And so we often get into this discussion about, well, if we apply the government standards, you would reach one conclusion. If you adjust for the fact that we have a unique system fully secured against the assets of the city, you might see a different view. Would you give us your best guidance as to how to look at that question?
Well, I appreciate Ken's report to you. So this is the second year that I've heard Ken come before you and talk about these long-term obligations, and he's instituted, this green light, red light, yellow light way of looking at it, which I think is fantastic. And so there's a couple ways that you can look at this. One is pure cash flow. So can we pay these obligations when the time comes? And I think that's what Ken's trying to help you with. Do we have the cash flow to meet these obligations? And I think what he's telling you, at least for FPD&R, is that you do. So you have this and I appreciate that you evaluate that property tax I don't think it's every year, but about every 2 years, I think you go out and the evaluation is over a 40-year period of time. There's an evaluation of what do we look like? Is there a chance that we won't have enough property tax? So one way to looking at it is, do we have the cash to meet the obligation? And I think Ken's steering you there. A second way of looking at it, though, is more of this kind of intergenerational equity. I think we've used that term in reporting to you. The reality is that your employees earn the right to those benefits as they provided service for the city, and we didn't put money aside for that. So the issue is that there's a benefit provided to the community in prior years, a benefit that's been earned, but the city hasn't funded it yet. So the actual funding is going to come from future generations. So another way that's maybe not on the positive side is you've incurred that cost already. You haven't withheld the revenues to pay for it. So a future generation has to pay not only a current cost, but they're going to have to cover that legacy cost, I think is the term that Ken used. So there's an intergenerational equity issue that exists, but I think you've approached that too because you've changed the system. Every police and fire person hired after, 2006, I think, is now going into Oregon PERS, and you're funding that on a current basis. So your issue is with everyone that was hired prior to 2006. There's a legacy cost there that will take you, I don't know, it's 20 or 25 years, I think, to work through. I liked Ken's predecessor called it the pig and the python. What will happen if this legacy obligation, imagine it working through the python, there's going to be a period of time where 20 years of that generation is going to pay that legacy cost plus the current cost.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you offhand can remember what the 5 federal grants were that you looked into.
Let's see. Oh, it's not in here, is it?
And if you don't, that's all right. You could just get back to me later. I'm just interested in that particular act.
It's not in here. It's in the single audit report, which was issued separately. And I don't think Sheila's here either. Yes? Okay.
I'm sorry, I can't hear what you're saying.
There's a link in Exhibit A of your documents that will take you
Oh.
to the single.
All right, thank
I
you.
don't have that committed to memory, so I apologize, but
Well, I have another one then. Do you happen to remember where is our new landfill? I didn't know we bought a landfill.
yeah, it's a sledge pond, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's for disposal of solids at at your wastewater treatment plant.
Oh, thank you.
It's just across the slough, and we saw a diagram, I think last week or this week, because we came with a change order. And it's where we treat the solids under the sun, and now we're removing legacy solids to make room for new solids.
Yeah, I didn't realize that was a new thing. That's great.
I thought she was going a different direction. I
Yeah.
thought she was going to ask you to tell us where those grants were, because under one interpretation of some recent executive orders, we may not have as much federal money coming to the city, in which case we're going to ask for a discount in the next audit that you do.
Well, and you will get that, because if you have fewer funds, there's a lesser effort required to do that audit work.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any further board conversation? I'll entertain a motion in a second to accept the report.
So moved?
Second.
Any further discussion? I should have asked, is there any public testimony on this item of the audit? Please call the roll.
Fritz,
Well, thank you. Once again, it's very clear and clearly stated, and I appreciate the explanations as well as the work. Aye.
Thank you.
Fish,
Jim, I also want to compliment you for the subliminal advertising that is included in your statement, because I notice on page 5, it says as follows: auditor independence in fact and appearance is essential so the public may justifiably perceive the audit process as blah, blah. We will treat that as testimony for the matter that follows the next time certain. I've had the benefit of being in this chair during the last 8 years when you've made these presentations. And you do a superb job, and there were a number of years where you identified things which were of some concern to the council. And I think the most important thing for me is that you've gotten that you've had no resistance from management, and that the recommendations that you've made have been embraced by the city. We'll always make mistakes. The question is, will we correct them? And you present a very complicated subject very clearly to this body, and I appreciate very much your work and the auditor's office work on this annual exercise. Thank you, sir. Aye.
Yeah, and I might just comment on that. I probably should have said this earlier, but when we do these audits, it's oftentimes where people don't want to hear from auditors. If we have a finding or, there's kind of that, and I guess our experience here with the city has never been like that. They have a true philosophy of trying to improve. And so they embrace, I think, our observations and recommendations, and it's been a great experience in that regard.
Thank you, sir.
Saltzman,
Thank you. Aye.
Udaly,
Thanks. Aye.
Wheeler,
It's a rare day when our fiscal team gets called out, and I appreciate, Ken, the work you did, the work your team did. We have a lot of the finance team that was recognized earlier in this chamber, and we recognize other employees when they step up to the plate and they work longer hours so they can get something done more quickly and more effectively. So I really want to appreciate that and acknowledge it. The finance team doesn't always get the recognition they deserve, but they're an important partner for all of the work that we do up here. So when you're saying nice things to us about this audit, it is really them and their hard work. I also want to applaud the managers who are directly related to some of these recommendations. I listen very carefully for how managers respond to the kinds of issues that are raised in these reports. And I couldn't be more pleased with the kind of feedback that I have heard. And I want to thank you for your thoroughness. It's really, I had nothing to do with this. I'm inheriting what appears to be a pretty clean audit situation. And I think that's a good thing as far as government accountability and transparency. So again, I'm an enthusiastic aye. The report is accepted. The next item is a time certain, so why don't we take about a 10-minute break? And Auditor Ho-Caballero, if you wouldn't mind, could I speak to you for just a moment to walk through what I think the process is going to be?
Okay.
Thank you.
Hey, Ted.
We're in recess. everybody. We are back in session. This is the Wednesday, February 1st, continuation of the 2 p.m. City Council meeting. If the clerk would please call the next item.
Item 104, place a measure on the May 16, 2017 ballot to amend city charter provisions to protect auditors' independence.
Very good. Now, before we invite the auditor and her team up, I'd like to just set out what I think is the process this afternoon. I'd like to get some head nods on this. First of all, I'd like to bring to your attention that there are 3 documents that we have. We have Exhibit A, which is the consensus replacement amendment that takes into account all of the council amendments that were put forward during last week's prior discussion. We also have a second page that includes 2 proposed auditor amendments that I will ask to be included in a moment. We also have an extensive matrix that lays out all of the competing amendments as well as those that were already included. It basically lays out all the amendments that have been proposed up to this point, and I'll be using that as the basis of discussion for the amendments itself. So first, I'd like to move the substitution consensus amendment Exhibit A. Could I get a second?
Second?
It's actually, there was a change in it that I had asked. I didn't put it form as a formal motion. So it's right on the front page, the salary. We had that discussion last week about including effective January 1st, 2019. The salary of the auditor shall be the same as the city commissioner.
Commissioner, may I make a suggestion? If we place the substitute, the consensus substitute on the table, and it's now been moved and seconded, then as we go through the
I see,
auditor's
I'm sorry.
matrix, I think we understand you
I
will flag
apologize,
that,
yes.
and we'll have the discussion with the auditor.
Thank
Yes,
you.
and I will make a special effort to remember that as well. The auditor has further requested that I move and seek a second on 2 other proposed amendments that you have before you.
I'll
The-
second them.
Thank you. Auditor's proposed amendment number 2 and auditor's proposed amendment number 3. At this point, I will remind people that there is no public testimony today. We already had the public testimony at the last meeting, so the record is closed. We heard public testimony as well as received written testimony on this item. So this is a continuation of the resolution process to move the auditor's proposal to the May ballot. With,
Question?
yes, sir.
I'm curious why Exhibit A is labeled a consensus replacement. There've been no vote on amendments yet, and my amendment's not part of the consensus replacement, so how is this a consensus if my amendment isn't part of it?
So I
How does it
believe,
earn the title consensus when there's been no
right,
votes?
well,
So I
my
move-
understanding is that these are the
Something going on behind closed doors?
the issues where there was agreement between the city council and the auditor on these. There's no conflict between the council and the auditor.
So this, Mayor, is a substitute, and it is our intention then to propose amendments to it. And that would
Correct.
include Commissioner Saltzman's amendment.
Correct.
And Commissioner Fritz's amendment, and the auditor has proposed 2 amendments. Exclusive of those amendments, this now incorporates the changes that the council has not, that is not in controversy with.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
So with that, I will invite the auditor and her team up, and what I would propose is we go through the amendments as listed on the matrix. Some of these amendments are already included in the consensus document. And at the end of the discussion on each of the proposed amendments, we'll vote on the amendments, then we'll take a final vote on the resolution as amended. Does that work for everybody?
Yes, except I do believe we need to add Commissioner Saltzman's amendment because it's not in the current
We will
matrix.
have that opportunity because it is in the matrix as one of the proposed amendments that we will have a vote on today. So we will have that opportunity. But it was not agreed to by the auditor, and therefore it is not in this substitute consensus amendment. Does that work for everybody? Good.
Just strike the name consensus, that probably won't make it work.
Very good. Okay, so first off, the first item was Mayor number 1. These have already been included. I'm withdrawing Mayor number 1.
Which is about collective bargaining.
Correct.
Because people may not have the.
Sorry,
things at
thank
hand.
you. Fish number 1 is up next. Commissioner Fish.
Madam Auditor, it's my understanding that this is in the substitute that you have presented before us, correct?
Correct.
So I withdraw my amendment.
Commissioner Fish withdraws fish number 1. Next up is fish number 2 on behalf of the auditor.
I will defer to Commissioner Fritz on this.
Thank you. There was a discussion last week about whether this makes it more clear that the salary of the auditor shall be the same that it is right now. I'm afraid that by saying it should be in 2019, it implies that the salary of the auditor could be anything up until that point, either lower or higher than the salary of a commissioner. So I would just like to say the salary shall be the same as the city commissioner.
So the commissioner has moved the inclusion of a date specific. Is there a second?
Second for discussion purposes.
Second for discussion purposes. Why don't we go ahead and have the discussion?
I'd ask to turn to the auditor. Madam Auditor, I understand the issue that Commissioner Fritz has raised, and I guess her point is if we strike the language effective January 1, 2019, the status quo reverts, which is that your salary would remain the same as a city commissioner. What do you believe is the advantage of making this effective in a future year?
I strictly was trying to make it clear that even though the language without the date is what the status quo is, that this was just, it's my understanding that this is the way you would do something in a charter to label the effective date that something would start officially as a charter provision.
My read, and I'm just giving you my sense, is that if the charter says the salary of the auditor shall be the same as a city commissioner, and if this exchange, this discussion creates legislative history that you are and will continue to have the same salary, I believe, my only concern is the effective date might give someone a belief that it wasn't currently the law.
Right, it is not in charter currently. I think it says currently that you set my salary. And so it just happens that in practice, it is set the same as yours. And so this just, as charter language, gives it a start date that it would have the force of charter behind it. It does not have the force of charter behind it today.
Why wouldn't we want that to start right away?
I think this is just an expression to the public that this is not about the auditor sitting in the office today, and that it is intended to be for the auditor who has the next term.
So can I turn to council for a second? Because I think you see where we're going on this, council. And the intent of the council and the auditor is to clarify, is to make clear that the auditor's salary shall be the same as a commissioner. Does the effective date language add or detract from that?
So it gets at two different things. The language where it says that the salary shall be fixed the same as a city commissioner puts into the charter the practice that is currently followed, that the auditor's salary is set and is currently the same as a city commissioner. The clause at the beginning, if it were to be included, effective January 1st, 2019, gets at a different concern, which is, as the auditor expressed, the charter change would not go into effect until the term of the next auditor election cycle. So it would not go into effect. So it avoids a potential question that could arise of, is this changing the salary of the auditor during the current term of the elected official? The answer is that that's only a problem from an ethics standpoint if the auditor was participating in the election, changing her salary during her term. That's not really a problem that's presented because this is being sent out to the voters for approval, and therefore that ethical question is potentially one of academic interest, but is not a legal problem. So it's not necessary, but if it's the auditor's preference that that be the case, then that would be something to include.
Mayor, I'm agnostic on this. Do you have a view one way or another? I think we've had legal advice that says that it doesn't add or detract.
The legal advice we're getting is it doesn't matter, but the reality is we're not setting the auditor's salary here. What we're doing is we're referring it to the voters for them to be able to decide. And the question will be asked repeatedly over the course of the discussion leading up to the vote. Is this something the auditor is doing that potentially rises to self-dealing? And having been in a similar situation previous, I understand why the auditor would want this included.
Well, on that basis, then I would move my amendment.
Is there a second? There's a motion and a second. Is there any further council discussion on this issue? Madam Auditor?
No, I just want to clarify that the date will be in there in your motion. Okay.
Please call the roll on the amendment.
Fritz.
I think we were doing the charter, it's just the constitution for the next 100 years. And so having an effective date in there seems to be unnecessarily complicating it. No.
Fish.
Aye.
Saltzman.
Aye.
Udaly.
Aye.
Wheeler.
Aye. The amendment is included. The next is Fish, number 3, on behalf of the League of Women Voters. Just to clarify 2506A, the administrative authority, it's my understanding this is already included in the substitute amendment. 2506G is not. Commissioner Fish?
Yes, I withdraw my, the 2-506G.
2506G is withdrawn.
Without a substitute?
I'm not offering it, no.
So I thought I got a memo from the League of Women Voters saying that I don't understand what's happened here.
The auditor has accepted the first part of, well, let's turn to the auditor. What now is in the substitute?
In the consensus draft is 2-506A, and we have, at the request of the League of Women Voters, remove the word policies and practices, so that's the rule-making provision. The League also wanted 2-506G, and I thought that was redundant to Commissioner Fish's amendment number 1, which has a public comment and notice provision. And so I was objecting to the need to form a committee to go over rules, because I think that the public comment piece will get at that.
And so to be clear, when this was brought to my attention, I thought the most compelling part of the suggestion was clarifying reasonable public notice and opportunity to comment and public participation. And that's been agreed to in the substitute.
Right, I thought that was a great
I thought
suggestion
that
by the League.
And so that has been agreed to. And absent an agreement with the auditor, I've just decided to withdraw the amendment, the other portion.
Saltzman, number 1. Commissioner, sorry.
Oh, this is the,
Yeah, it's your-
this is my one amendment, yeah, okay.
Yes.
So, as I said last week, this is, I have no issue with the ombudsman. I think the ombudsman does great work. My opposition really is a size of government thing. I don't believe we should be locking into the charter, which is our constitution, as Commissioner Fritz just said, a position and the office that goes with it. I feel that should be a discretionary, it should not be locked into our charter, because I just believe few positions are mentioned in our charter, and I don't believe the ombudsman rises to the level of being locked into the charter. I have no qualm whatsoever with the work of the ombudsman and the good work, in this case, that she is currently doing, but past ombudsman as well. It's just a size of government issue for me. So I would urge adoption.
I move the amendment, Mayor.
Is there a second?
Second.
There's a motion and a second. Further discussion? Carla, could you please call the roll?
Fritz.
I do appreciate the work that has been done to amend the Ombudsman's section. I agree with Commissioner Saltzman that it's not necessary. We did hear a lot of testimony, however, that the public wants to have it there. And we did amend, the auditor has agreed to an amendment that says specifically that the Ombudsman may investigate within the Office of Auditor, since we heard the concern from the community that the Ombudsman might not be able to investigate the independent police review. So with that change, I think it's good for now, and hopefully we'll be having a full charter commission in a few years that can take another look at it. Aye.
Fish.
Am I aye or no?
Just a minute. She's knowing.
I think you're
I'm
right.
knowing,
She
yes.
is knowing, correct.
Sorry. Thank you.
Fish.
Commissioner Saltzman, I appreciate you bringing this issue forward, and we've had a chance to have a good discussion with the public, and I'm not persuaded that it should be taken from the proposal before us, but I appreciate your position and the conversation we've had. No.
Saltzman.
Aye.
Udaly.
No.
Wheeler.
No, the amendment fails. Fritz, number 1. This is on the qualifications. Commissioner Fritz?
And this was an either-or, Mayor, so I've withdraw this particular one and instead move 1B.
Fritz has withdrawn item number 1.
1A,
I'm sorry, 1.
and I'm, and I'm actually amending 1B after discussions with the auditor. She's very concerned about not limiting when the assessments have to happen. And so I'd like to withdraw the last line. These assessments shall occur in the 3rd year of an auditor's term. But the rest of the section would remain, and it says that the auditor shall periodically conduct, but not less than every 4 years, organizational efficiency and compliance assessments, the results of which shall be made public. And then I believe the auditor, we have in there also the auditor may contract with outside service providers to conduct the assessments.
So I will second Commissioner Fritz's Amendment 1B. I'm now just a little confused. The auditor's proposed amendment here as well. Can you and the auditor explain to us if we now have a consensus amendment or if there are 2 amendments?
I believe we do have a consensus
That's-
amendment, which would
Indeed,
be
so.
my alternative.
Right, the right-hand column rather than the left.
Then I second the auditor's alternative, which has been approved by Commissioner Fritz.
And just a question, Madam Auditor, the last sentence that says may contract with outside service providers, would they not always be outside service providers if they're investigating within your office?
After we had some of our conversations, after the work session, I went back to the Secretary of State's office, and they do a combination of internal review as the work goes along, and then periodically they bring in an outside or an external reviewer to come in and look at their work. So it's a combination of peer review and external audits. And so we thought that was a good model. And also where they use some outside expertise is when they were setting up their procedures and their the way they do human resources and procurement around those areas. And so
Yeah.
we thought that was a better model instead of having the whole thing always having to go out and contract. We thought that we could have some savings by doing the hybrid like they do.
Well, yeah, to be clear though, that the point of this amendment was to make sure that there is somebody, it's not the council who's overseeing what the auditor does. It needs to be somebody who's not the auditor overseeing what the auditor does. So do you think your last sentence increases the likelihood of that or decreases it?
I think that it's, the plan is to do both, to not expend funds we don't need to spend on outside expertise, and to reserve that when we have enough procurements or enough human resources work, that then we would have people come in from the outside and review that work to make sure that we're in compliance with our policies and procedures and state and federal law.
Well, to be clear, I hope that the every 4 years audit would naturally include somebody from outside giving an opinion on the work.
Right, and I believe that we had made the language that the auditor shall periodically do this, and so at some point in a term, the auditor would be required by charter to do that. And then those documents would need to be made public. That's also in the language.
And I had not noticed that you had deleted the contract periodically with outside service providers. So that really actually materially changes the point of the amendment. I was focused on what you and I had discussions about was when it should happen. And yet this amendment that I'm seeing now doesn't seem to ensure that there's always an outside audit of something in the auditor's office every 4 years.
May I ask a clarifying question of the auditor? Because you referenced, you raised the question about efficiencies and cost. Is it your concern here that if you are required to use an outside service provider, that you may be incurring a cost that the council will not factor into your budget?
I think that I am trying to apply some common sense to the scale of work we do in my office and to follow the model of the Secretary of State's office where they have some internal peer review procedures and we've gotten their documentation about how they do that. And then also periodically bring in an outside set of eyes to look at what our internal procedures and our peer review procedures are, and then to provide some assurance that we're on the right track and we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. And so it's a combination of providing accountability to the public as well as not incurring a bunch of expenses at dollar amounts that I don't think would be appropriate for the scale of the contracts and the hiring that we do.
But to be clear, Commissioner Fritz and you have reached agreement on the concept and on the frequency. Now we are just debating whether it should be conducted by an outside provider or some combination of inside or outside. Am I correct?
Right. And I believe we could get at some of that
From
through
my
the
perceive-
rulemaking.
From my
procedures.
perspective, no, that's really
I'm
not.
just trying to make sure I understand I was just trying to highlight what I understood as the divide.
Yeah.
And now that question is for us to decide.
I see.
And I'll turn, once again, if I could, to the mayor, the former treasurer, to ask if you have a strong view on this.
I don't have a strong view because I still don't understand the divide. So I'd like clarity on that. The first part of the amendment here says the auditor shall periodically conduct, but not less than every 4 years, organizational efficiency and compliance assessments, the results of which shall be made public. What is being proposed here is the addition of the clause, contract periodically with outside service providers to conduct. I don't understand what the substantive difference is.
So may I take a
Please.
shot at it?
Yes, please.
If you look at the left-hand column, this is what I thought we were discussing, in which I had the conversation, and I thought that the only change that the auditor wanted, which I agreed to, was that when these assessments should happen. The sentence above that says, the auditors shall contract periodically, but no less than every 4 years, with outside service providers to conduct organizational efficiency and compliance assessments, the result of which shall be made public. So my intent was, if we are giving a future auditor absolute independence, the public and the council perhaps in future years will need somebody from who's not us to say, how is it going within the auditor's office?
Yeah, that makes sense. You know, in the Treasury, we had internal auditors. Of course, we had external auditors, just as the city does, and we heard from our external auditors earlier today. But the internal auditors also have a audit committee that is a public engagement process. It's full of people who are really smart. They understand the importance of internal audits, and they don't report to the treasurer, they report to the public. And so, you know, maybe that's one possibility, as long as we're having this debate. But I see what the commissioner is trying to say.
I would just say that it's my intent to use a combination of those things. We are and have been following the model of the Secretary of State's office. I would not understand why we'd want to put in charter that we had to use external reviews if the scope of the work that we're doing in any given year doesn't rise to the level of paying someone extra money. To do that, when we can provide the documentation and show the peer review, make that available to the public, I would say that if somebody did have concerns about that we could at that point go and have an external review come in at the request of the public. But it would be, in the term, because we are required now by the language in here to do this in the auditor's term, that in my mind, the common sense way to go forward would be to have a combination of those things.
I know that you have the purest of intentions. We're talking about future auditors who might look at this as a little kingdom or queendom where they have absolute control over the budget, they have absolute control over administrative rules, everything else. I, as a citizen, would want to have somebody other than the auditor saying it's going well or it's not going so well.
So can I make a suggestion? For me, I appreciate that this issue has been framed, and I appreciate that we're also making sure that those reviews are made public, and because this is in effect becomes another check and balance. I think now we have a good faith question or perhaps disagreement about what blend of outside and inside services and how prescriptive we have to be. We have before us first and seconded the right-hand column provision. Mayor, I suggest we test to see the council appetite on this, and if it fails in a vote, then we come back and amend it.
But before we get to the vote, I have one more question. So if I'm reading this correctly, and I want to make certain that I am, if I look at how this is written, and let's include for the moment, for the purposes of discussion, Commissioner Fritz's contract periodically with outside service providers to conduct. It's my understanding the way this reads now is there would be at least one external audit every 4 years, plus the auditor would have the ability to conduct organizational audits beyond that. Is that a correct reading?
That's not the correct reading of what we're just about to vote on, because the auditor's version does not have any requirement for an outside review.
Right, because the auditors,
Mayor, to achieve that end, what
Yes.
you just said, you would need to bring a motion to remove the deletion
correct,
in the middle of the amendment that's on the table, so that, to your point, there would be at least a requirement every 4 years for an external, and the auditor would then have the authority to use a balance of inside and outside for other reviews.
very
You
good.
have to bring
Okay,
that
so
amendment.
let's,
Actually, that is exactly my amendment.
Right.
On the left-hand column, without the last sentence in yellow.
If I may, could I clarify what
Please.
this terminology means on a certain level? The proposal, as we originally discussed it at the work session and at the hearing last week, was that to achieve some administrative independence, that we have procurement, human resources, and the budget office who come in and do various checks on the auditor's office. We're removing those checks and we're replacing them with independent sources of checks. And so, for example, if we do 4 procurements a year, which is what we do on average, that we have some controls around our budget. We have things that are identified in code that we're supposed to be doing. And if we're going to continue to use the council as the local control or local contract review board. And so there are ways that the public can understand what we're doing and see this in ways that they haven't now, because we're going to be making this material public. So right now, if the procurement or HR are looking at our decision-making on a transactional basis, they're looking at the front end, we're going to continue to do those front-end checks, but we're also going to have an external review periodically, and that will also be made public. And so my only hesitation about having it be in the charter that we have to use outside service providers on any sort of regularity, that was my concern. I think that if we could find a way that we would do it once in an auditor's term would be fine.
Well, that's why I removed the last sentence, but there does need to be some kind of outside review, objective review, otherwise the auditor is not reviewed by anybody.
Well, like I said, if we do a contract, we come to you as the local contractor. So there are checks that exist. And so if it is that you want to make the outside assessments in charter required,
with the understanding that a subsequent budget request may take into account the fact that you've been required to do that, and you would give us the opportunity to determine whether you need additional funds to perform that function. It would be my expectation, as long as I have the honor of serving on this body, that if we are requiring you to do something like that, that you have sufficient funds to do it, that don't compete against other programs of your department. So Mayor, I think, do we have consensus on this now?
Well, let's call the question. So this would be
Which question?
Auditor 2,
As amended or not?
as amended.
So the auditor side, the right-hand side.
Correct. Unless, it's at the will of my colleagues. What would you like to do first?
Well, if it's the auditors as amended, I think technically that reverts back to the Fritz Amendment.
Well,
I'm
so
trying to keep it
I'm happy to start with either. I mean, let's take the temperature and see where we are.
I'd really like to vote on the amendments I proposed minus the
Okay,
last.
so
Madam
we
Auditor,
already
on the
have,
Fritz Amendment, which
Yes.
requires an outside audit, since we're about to vote on that, can you live with that?
My objection to Commissioner Fritz's wording was that the assessments have, that they shall occur in the third year. I think that is overly prescriptive for charter language.
So Commissioner Fritz,
That's what I've said. We'll remove that. That's the
if we
conversation we
remove
had.
Agree to
that,
that.
if we remove that from Fritz 1B, are you agnostic on us proceeding with this?
Well, I would also say that in hers, it's requires that the auditor shall contract.
Correct, for every 4 years.
So I would think that would be something that we wouldn't want to order a contractual relationship in charter for this kind of review.
There's no other review.
Your alternate language was shall periodically conduct, but not unless every 4 years without the contract language.
Would not be outside. I mean, the audits that we are used to here are things that we look through as a means to do things better. The other way of doing audits is to look to see if there's anything the matter, and that's something that the public needs to have once during each auditor's term, because we're not
Okay.
experts.
I view conduct and contract as functionally the equivalent with the distinction that contract matches up better with outside service providers.
Okay.
And with the understanding that that's within your discretion.
So then Commissioner Fritz's, if with the last sentence withdrawn, I think gets at
Thank
her
you.
concern.
good. And to be slightly annoying, but to do this properly, can I please get a motion and a second on the amendment to the amendment, which is the withdrawal of the last
So
section
moved.
of 1B? And a second?
Second.
Can is there any further board discussion on the amendment to the amendment? Hearing none, call the roll on the amendment to the amendment 1B.
My understanding is we're voting on my version without the last sentence.
Not yet.
Not yet.
We're getting there. This is one step up the hill.
Would you like to tell me what I should vote on this?
Aye.
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 Saltzman?
Aye.
Aye.
Wheeler?
Aye. And we already have a motion and a second on 1B as amended. Any further discussion on this item? As amended, can you call the roll,
Oh,
please? Oh,
Point of clarification.
Yes, sir.
You're voting on the language set forth on the left-hand
the
column.
left-hand side, Fritz 1B as
As
amended
amended to remove the language in yellow.
in the last line.
Right.
And we've already passed
already
the
voted
amendment
on
to the
that,
amendments.
yes.
We've stricken the last line. Now the
You've struck-
question on the
struck the
table
last sentence.
is amendment 1B as amended.
And that's the language
Call the
that's
roll.
being voted on.
Thank you, colleagues, especially you. See how much I trust you, Commissioner Fix. I ask you in public what I should vote, and you tell me. That's very helpful.
I'm
Aye.
going to put that in my hip pocket. I appreciate this conversation, and it is completely consistent with the collaborative way in which the auditor's office and the council have approached this project, and I appreciate that. Aye.
Saltzman?
Aye.
Udaley?
Aye.
Wheeler?
Aye, thank you.
Thank you.
So the Fritz 1B has been approved. Fritz number 2, 2505, pertaining to the budget.
Shall I introduce this?
On the right.
Yes, so this is a similarly complicated one. This is about the budget, and the auditor has provided some very helpful revisions to the language, just clarifying how the budget gets done. There's also an addition of a carryover proposal, which will be the subject of a second motion. Commissioner Tommy?
So why
Yes?
don't you, would you move the auditors 3?
I moved the auditors 2-505.
And I will second it. Mayor, I might just comment, the changes that the auditor has incorporated reflect testimony we received and some concerns that were raised, and in my view, greatly strengthen the provision towards making clear that the council and the mayor have the final say on the auditor's budget. And so I appreciate those changes.
Very good.
I understand there is now an amendment, someone's going to offer an amendment to this amendment.
But do we vote on it first before I amend it? No, for the amendment now.
You have to bring the amendment to the amendment
Okay,
first.
so then I also,
And then we'll get to you.
Okay.
I propose that we delete the line that says the auditor's budget may include carryover of any unused funds from year to year as provided by state law.
Is there a second?
You're deleting it or adding it?
So she is moving that we delete the following sentence. The auditor's budget may include carryover of any unused funds from year to year as provided by state law. So it has been moved and second. Again, this is an amendment to an amendment. Madam Auditor?
Yes, I view this as an important element in addressing the organizational impairments that are related to the budget process, and which we've discussed before. It essentially removes the opportunity for the budget office, which we audit, to have influence over the auditor's budget. The overall section in the proposal is the carryover is in keeping with the overall goal of creating a dialogue among the 6 elected officials about the auditor's budget. It's about mutual respect for our separate and distinct responsibilities. In the current process, the auditor's unspent funds at the end of the fiscal year are returned to the general fund. What I am proposing is that these funds remain available to the auditor's office. That would mean that the auditor would have access to a reserve of funds to address unforeseen expenses or to save for a future priority. Your fiduciary obligation is met so long as the funds are spent as originally approved for personnel or materials and services. My obligation to manage the affairs of the auditor's office can be met without having to ask permission for funds on a case-by-case basis. Because of the commission form of government, it is always true that the auditor is asking permission from officials who have competing priorities they'd like to fund, and the auditor has no champion or vote in the budget process. Let me use a recent example to illustrate how I would have used carryover funds had I been able to. An employee in Independent Police Review received a voicemail message in which the caller threatened to blow his head off. The caller then walked into IPR. He appeared to the investigators to be unwell. As you'd expect, this unnerved the employees who share space with the council clerk's office. A security review a few months prior to this incident indicated that physical buffers needed to be added to the counters in IPR in the council clerk's office. They cost more than was available to me in my budget. It was an unforeseen expense, and I did not get permission to access maintenance funding through facilities. I did not get permission during the budget monitoring process because the buffers were not a priority. I now have lost track of the status of this request, which I believe has been consumed by a larger conversation about security for this building. Consequently, my employees are as exposed to the danger today as they were 6 months ago when this occurred. I am unable to tell them when or if to expect the buffers. Had I had access to a reserve of funds for unforeseen expenses like this, they would not be waiting for the small measure of protection that they fully deserve. The ability to carry over funds does not mean that the mayor and council lose control over them. They can be factored into subsequent appropriations or used for other purposes should you decide that they are not necessary for the duties and responsibilities of the auditor's office. While the annual sums would likely be small in overall budget terms, we estimate that would be between $100,000 to $200,000, and probably that number would be going down given that we're undergoing some cut years. They would provide a measure of management control that is important to the independence of the auditor.
I'd be interested in the sense of the council before we move on this, because we have a couple of options, just of my colleagues.
So the only other place that I know of in the charter where any elected official has control over any amount of money by him or herself is the $5,000 that the mayor has authority to spend at will. I know. Shh. So all of us have the same challenge that if something happens within our offices, we need to put it forward and have the discussion. As I said at the hearing, half of all unspent money that goes back to the general fund is used on critical infrastructure maintenance. And we just heard from the reporting that we have huge deficits in infrastructure maintenance that need to be funded. And so the auditor would have the same ability like any of the rest of the elected officials to ask for a carryover with a specified purpose, and the council then would, acting in its capacity as the budget committee by state law, can approve that. This amendment essentially takes away the amendment I had in the first place and just puts it in a different place. And I believe it's equally confusing for folks.
Mr. Salzman? Mayor?
So I asked the budget office about this provision. And what they told me is whether, if that line is included, it doesn't materially change the current budget process. The reason being that it says may. And so it still makes clear that the final authority rests with the budget committee, which is the city council. But, here's the balance I think we're trying to strike here. The balance is operationally, I believe the auditor is correct that historically the numbers have been relatively small, and longer term, the question is if there's the implication in charter that the city council does not control those funds, the concern is the auditor essentially becomes a super agency if those savings start to add up at a time when the city could actually be needing funds for other purposes. And we are given the legal authority as the budget committee for the city. We're still responsible for the budget overall and making tough decisions about how to balance competing interests. If that provision is stricken, it also doesn't materially change the current procedure. It is still this committee's responsibility to allocate resources.
Mayor, if I may, while I agree with you that you always retain responsibility for the budget, in my mind, it doesn't give the auditor any sort of super control over those funds. I think what it does is change the presumption that they're automatically going back into the general fund into a process where the auditor's office is the only office in the city that does not have a champion or a vote and trying to compete and fight for funds in that process. I think it starts the conversation presuming that the funds reside in the auditor's office. If the auditor can make the case to you and to the council that we need those funds for a specific purpose or for an unforeseen expense.
Right. Well, there's two solutions I see to this mini stalemate, if I can call it that. Solution number one is to put a limit, and it could be a percentage of allocatable budget so that it doesn't just keep growing in perpetuity. And I think that would alleviate some of the concerns that you're hearing from fellow commissioners. Alternatively, number two, we could be very explicit and add language that clarifies the city council's role vis-a-vis the overall budget. It seems like either of those options.
So, Madam Auditor, I think I'm intrigued by one of the alternatives the mayor has proposed, although I think as a percentage, it becomes subject to interpretation. And because this is the charter, I would in its place suggest, given history, that I would just pose as an alternative that we set a hard cap of $100,000, so that we're clear that it is in keeping with historical norms and is not designed to set up an unlimited kitty. If we were to keep the language in here, it's clear to me that we can essentially treat that as a credit against your budget request to avoid you getting a windfall. So that's how we would address it through the budget process. If you carry over $100,000 and you ask for $1 million, we get to say you've already got $100,000 towards the $1 million, and so it's form over substance. Commissioner Fritz raises, I think, an important point that ending fund balances currently now revert to a process where half the money is then allocated to major maintenance. That's a new policy, and she was the champion of that. On the other hand, the money here is de minimis. And so I guess the question I would ask you is, what do you think of the idea of capping it at a certain amount, like 100,000?
You know, I'm going to introduce Sarah Landis, who does the budget for our office, to talk. She's a little more familiar with the year-over-year kinds of.
And before we get to that, I want to give Commissioner Udaly, if she wants to chime in. Everybody else got their opportunity. I want to make sure she has an opportunity as well.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm feeling torn on this issue. I feel that Commissioner Fritz has brought up valid issues, and the auditor has as well, but I don't, I'm not seeing how these various solutions ultimately are functionally different. I guess the cap, obviously. But is it my understanding that we could say, yes, you can keep the funds, but we may decide to just take them back anyway?
Could I just intervene?
Okay.
My understanding is that by state law, the council is the budget authority, and that we can't bind future councils. So if it says in the charter any number, 100,000, or even, the whole, as it suddenly reads, that is intending to be binding on future councils, which is against state budget law. So I would really prefer to just take that out. As I said, we are going to have another process in a few years to look at this again. I would suggest we want to see how it works out, have the conversations, and if necessary, we can put something in later. Trying to do it on the fly with picking a number, and the number for the past 5 years has averaged almost $500,000 a year.
There is one additional safety valve we could put on the table, which is, it is the prerogative of any of us, all 6 elected officials, to request that a certain amount of money be encumbered for a particular purpose.
Yes.
Now, we've done that, we do that in a formal way if there's a pending contract or a pending liability or whatever, we encumber it. It would certainly be my expectation that if the auditor said that there was a purpose towards, there was a need for carryover funds that met a health and safety, security issue or the like, that would simply be resolved by her communicating with the mayor that need, and the mayor agreeing with the budget office that it be encumbered for that purpose. That we could then sort it out in the budget process later, but so as not to deprive you of those funds for something you need right away. Mayor, do you agree with that?
I agree with that.
And that is my goal, essentially, is because we can't foresee everything. And the IPR example is the perfect one where I had no alternative. And so I think that that's what we're trying to get at with this language, is that it just continues the dialogue.
So we have, Madam Auditor, let me make a suggestion, because we have gotten to consensus on just about everything here. And would you consider accepting Auditor 3 with the amendment that we delete the carryover language based on the record we've just created that makes clear that if there is carryover funds which you need for a particular purpose, you would be accorded the same courtesies as other members of this body to approach the mayor and the budget office for an encumbrance? And then we'll work that out through rulemaking to make sure it's embedded in our understanding. And then test drive that to see if it works for you.
I think that is one way to go forward, and also you will recall that I would like to continue a conversation about a pilot project, and we could continue these conversations in that,
And I
to
think
that
you have-
avenue as well.
I think you're hearing the commitment of this body to be flexible and creative in meeting your goal, but I think the trade winds seem to be blowing in favor of deleting, so I would first give you the opportunity to agree to a friendly amendment to delete that sentence. If you would.
Yes, if we
okay.
could hopefully continue the conversation, I
So
would.
Mayor, now that we have a
Let's do it.
concurrence of the auditor, why don't we take up the amendment to delete it
So
and
this-
then adopt the amendment?
Yeah, this is a amendment to the amendment to delete the sentence, "The auditor's budget may include carryover of any unused funds from year to year as provided by state law." Any further conversation? Please call the roll, Carla.
Fritz,
Well, thanks to all 6 elected officials for this important discussion. Aye.
Fish.
Aye.
Saltzman.
Aye.
Udaly.
Aye.
Wheeler.
Aye. So Auditor 3 is, the amendment to the amendment has been approved. Now we're to the main motion, which is Auditor 3 as amended. Any further discussion on Auditor 3 as amended? Madam Auditor, any further discussion
No.
on this item? Carla, please call the roll on Amendment Auditor 3 as amended.
Fritz.
Aye.
Fish.
Aye.
Saltzman.
Aye.
Udaly.
Aye.
Wheeler.
Aye. And just to make sure we're doing the paperwork correctly, I assume then, Commissioner Fritz, you've withdrawn Fritz number 2.
Yes.
That is correct. So Fritz number 2 is withdrawn. Next up are Fritz number 3 through 5, and it's been brought to my attention that there has been consensus between you and the auditor in the substitution language under Exhibit A.
Yes, I'm very happy that the auditor and I were able to work out something that says very clearly that the compensation system established by the charter change and by the auditor will generally follow the classified services for the rest of the city employees.
Okay, so we have now withdrawn a number of amendments. We have passed a number of amendments. We have amended amendments. At this point, I would like to propose we take a 10-minute break to digest this, and I'd like to have a conversation with the auditor if I could. And assuming that we continue as we're doing, we will come back and then we will vote on the main motion as amended. So we'll take about a 10-minute break. Yes,
Just a
Commissioner Fritz.
quick point
Yes.
of clarification.
Yes.
So the 3 through 5 version that the auditor and I agreed on is part of the main document now. We
Very
can
good.
have to vote on it. All right,
Very
thank
good.
you.
Thank you for that clarification, Commissioner. Thank you. Okay. Thank you.
One more amendment? I think. Yes, it was. I think maybe you weren't here at the beginning, Mr. Handelman, that we did include in the shared version that the Office of the Ombudsman may investigate the Office of the Auditor. So we added to Ombudsman D, that the Ombudsman can investigate any bureau, whatever, including the Office of the Auditor. And thank you for bringing that to our attention last week. Wow, that's probably the hardest thing you'll ever do on your tax.
We're about to take a vote also. I want to clarify, first of all, there was some question as to whether the ballot title would need to be amended. I am advised that it does not, that the ballot title that we have here is good. What we're going to be doing is voting on a resolution to refer out a ballot title with a revised exhibit as approved previously by the council in proceedings until now. Before we get to that point, first of all, I'm going to ask if there's any further discussion on the main motion as amended. And if not, I'm going to turn it over to the auditor, and then we will take our vote. Is there any further discussion at this point? Madam Auditor.
I would just like to say how much I appreciate the conversations that we've had over the last few weeks about the auditor's office. You may know more about my office than you ever thought you would in these conversations, and I would like to affirm to the mayor and to Commissioner Udaly that I do not spend much time in this chamber, and I look forward to going back to the days when I don't spend a lot of time in this chamber. And you may not believe me, but it's true. But I really appreciate all of the collaboration and the conversation. Would like to acknowledge the work of City Ombudsman Margie Solinger, who has shouldered this responsibility for months now. She's, I'm sure, looking forward to going back to her day job. And I'd also like to acknowledge my predecessors, Jewel Lansing, Gary Blackmer, and Levon Griffin-Valade, who have been a source of wise counsel through this process. And I think there were times when I thought it wasn't going to work out, and so they were very supportive and encouraging to keep going. And I also want to acknowledge the people who came to this chamber last week in great numbers. I was very surprised by that. And 27 people signed up to testify, and it's a charter amendment about the auditor's office. And so that very much surprised me, and I'm very appreciative to them as well. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. And with that, Carla, could you please call the roll?
Fritz.
Well, thank you. And if I might make, as I'm voting, I'd like to make a request if the wonderful Ombudsman could do one final thing for us and put together all of the amendments that we did today and get us a version back tomorrow as soon as possible. We do have another council session tomorrow afternoon, so if it turns out that in the confusion, I want to make sure that we all agree on all of the backwards and forwards, so I'd really appreciate that.
Commissioner Fritz, if I may, the clerk is going to overtake a process
We'll
with
work
the
with Margie
Ombudsman
on that. And
to go through the testimony line by line and make sure that it's accurately
Thank you.
reflected. We'll make sure that all members of the city council have access to that.
And if possible, by tomorrow afternoon, in case we do have to do any kind of clarifications.
Margie says we can do it.
Thank you very much. I greatly appreciate the auditor and the previous auditors who came in for the hearing, and all of the folks who scrambled very quickly to give a lot of in-depth testimony, especially the League of Women Voters and Portland Cop Watch. All of the discussion has greatly improved the charter amendment. I do feel, in some ways, regretful that there wasn't time for a full community process, for instance, to look at the independent police review and other aspects of the auditor's office. However, this amendment at this point is one which I do believe is appropriate to ask the voters with a yes or no on the proposal as amended. So thank you to everybody for your good work on this. Aye.
Fish.
Colleagues, Madam Auditor, last week I made an extensive statement on the record as to why I strongly support this effort to strengthen the independence of the auditor's office and why I believe this is a singularly important reform effort. And I put it in the context of a number of other reform efforts that I have observed or witnessed or participated in over the last 8 years, and I think it deserves to be in the first tier of all of them. So I will not repeat myself. I have some thank yous and an acknowledgement. First, I want to thank the auditor and her staff for the way they engaged the council on this fairly complicated subject. And I cannot remember a time when we had a more collaborative exercise among colleagues. And there are 6 elected officials on this side of the river. And we are all independently elected, and we are each deserve to be treated with respect that goes to the office. And I believe we have modeled behavior through this exercise that I think can be a standard for how we engage on future issues. So I thank the auditor and her team. I want to thank Margie Solinger for her work. She has spent a lot of time working out the detail work. And now she can go back to doing her day job. But it has been an absolute pleasure working with you on this, and I thank you for your service. I want to echo what Commissioner Fritz said to thank League of Women Voters, CopWatch, and the neighborhood folks, and everyone who came in and helped us get it right. A special thank you to my friend Debbie Iona, who I think presented to us a very good idea, which will be reflected not only in the referral, but in subsequent rulemaking when we discuss how the public will be engaged going forward. And I thank Debbie for that. I want to thank all my colleagues, but in particular, I want to thank the two newest members of the council. It has not been a very eventful month, and I don't want them to get the wrong impression about what it is to serve in city government. Because sometimes we actually have, crises that we have to deal with and complex matters. So we hope you've not been lulled into a false sense of complacency. But with all seriousness, I've been on this body for 8 years, and the last month has given me a great sense of hope for this body and the way in which we will, as a governing body, lead moving forward. And I particularly appreciate what our two newest members of the council have brought to the dynamics and chemistry of this body. I want to thank Jim Blackwood in my office and Sonia Schmansky for all the work they did, and each of us have staff people who've worked diligently on this, and they have been particularly great. I want to just close by saying on a personal level, it was a thrill to have Jewel Lansing here. She literally wrote the book, and she had a very strong view that she shared with us, and it was a memorable moment. But I also want to acknowledge another leader in our community who was particularly strong in the advocacy that she brought to this effort with me, and that's former Governor Barbara Roberts. And Governor Roberts reached out to me and offered a perspective as a former Secretary of State about how important this work was and how strongly she supported this referral. And I believe she is our most esteemed elected official, past or present, and I took very seriously the concerns that she raised, and I thank her for being my friend and mentor and role model. Today, we are now voting on a very important referral, and if passed, we will all have an opportunity to support that referral that goes to the voters, which I will do enthusiastically, and then assuming it passes, we'll come back and do some rulemaking and collectively commit to making this work. I'm very proud to cast an aye vote today, and thank you.
Saltzman.
Well, I appreciate, Auditor, your dogged determination as of about probably going back at least 6-7 months to bring these charter amendments to fruition today, or at least to the next stage of getting them before the voters. I think you've had a clear vision of how to make your office more independent, and you have pursued that, and I appreciate that. And although I may have disagreed on some of the details and what to do, but I have a fundamental respect for the job you've done, and also our ombudsman as well in helping to craft these proposals before us today. And I also particularly want to recognize the mayor's office. I think the mayor's office worked with the auditor to really, help get these amendments to the point where we are voting on them today. And I want to acknowledge that as well. So pleased to support these, and I hope the voters will say aye on whatever day in May that is. Aye.
Daly.
I was pleased to be part of this process. It was very helpful for me as a newcomer to deepen my understanding of our form of government as well as the function of the auditor's office. I'm excited to get to vote yes on this referral. I'm almost assuming that it's happening now, though, so I need to moderate my enthusiasm here. I'm also looking forward to the public perhaps learning more about the function of the auditor's office and hopefully seeing the office put into the proper place in our governmental structure, as well as being able to reassure the public that we are being held accountable. We will miss you, Madam Auditor. Please don't be a stranger. Aye.
Wheeler.
Well, let me add my thanks to the record. This is obviously, I will use the word historic. This is an historic moment. It's not every day that we refer such a significant charter amendment to the voters, and it's one I obviously heartily support. This, Madam Auditor, is what I think is an excellent example in demonstrating that leadership and consensus building go hand in hand. And I think you and your team did a phenomenal job in terms of making that happen over the previous weeks. As everybody knows, government accountability is under siege. And we're looking for ways to give the public confidence that this body is in fact an accountable body. And I believe the independence of the auditor is critical to making sure that the public has the confidence that there is somebody watching the watchers, which effectively is what we have here. And I think it's a very appropriate function and a necessary function. I also want to thank the auditor's team. There are a lot of people in this city hall and in the other buildings around town that work very, very hard. Their work is often unheralded. We heard today from a number of accountants who worked really long hours to get our financial audit in order. The financial auditor described the city of Portland as a model client. I think he even said a star client, which is a pretty remarkable thing for a financial auditor to say. I absolutely want to thank your team, because I know there are a lot of people who worked long and hard behind the scenes, answered tons of questions, worked with us on revisions and different ideas. The Ombudsman, Margie, you did just a tremendous job here, and I want to add my thanks to my fellow commissioners. I agree with Commissioner Fish. It was exciting to see 4 former auditors. This is a function that sometimes doesn't get the acclaim it deserves. It's not held up in the spotlight like other elected positions often are, but it is fundamental to our democracy. And so I think whatever we have done, whatever we can do to strengthen that function is critically important. I agree with the auditor. I was actually surprised how many people came to testify, and they weren't just testifying half-heartedly. People came and really poured their heart and their soul into their testimony, and it was fact-based, as we'd expect testimony around an auditor function to be. But nearly all of them used the word accountability at some point during their testimony, and I want to underscore that. I'd like to thank others throughout the city, the budget office, the legal team, the Office of Management and Finance. A lot of people worked very hard with us, with the auditor and others. In my own office, while everybody touched this at some point, Kristen Dennis, who's here in the room today, she put Henry Kissinger to shame in terms of shuttle diplomacy. And I want to thank you, Kristen, for the long hours and the hard work you put in. And again, I want to thank the auditor and her team for being very, very responsive to the back and forth that was established over this process. I want to remind everybody that this is one of those things where we on the City Council don't get the last word, nor does the auditor get the last word on this issue. This now is going to be referred to the voters, and it's up to the voters to decide whether or not this is something that they want to include in the charter for the city of Portland. I obviously will be encouraging that they do, but that is their determination. And so in that regard, I wish this the best of luck. I am an enthusiastic aye. And with that, the resolution is adopted as amended. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, colleagues. We are now adjourned.
Well done.